Victoria Delgado withdrew her hand in the middle of a boardroom filled with high-level executives, staring fixedly at the single father in the worn grey suit whose proposal she had just dismissed without even hearing it. Her smile was thin, disdainful. "Our company doesn't do charity. You should leave before you embarrass yourself further." Mateo Vega lowered his arm without a word, thanked her, and walked out. Neither of them knew that before the day ended she would pay for the handshake she refused to give. Who was he really? The Sterling Group lobby was designed to make people feel small. 40 feet of polished marble rose toward a ceiling where the company name hung in brushed steel, catching the morning light that poured through the glass front. Mateo Vega stood at reception in a grey suit that had seen better years, holding a thin leather folder against his chest. He gave his name quietly, said he had a meeting with the investment committee, and waited as the woman behind the counter looked him over twice before printing his badge. She handed it to him the way people hand over something they expect to regret. He had chosen the suit deliberately. It was clean and pressed, but it was old. And the difference between old and cheap was a distinction Mateo had learned most people never bothered to make. The watch on his wrist was still ordinary, the kind a man buys once and keeps for 15 years. No one who passed him in that lobby gave him a second look, and that was exactly what he wanted. He had come to see how this building treated a man who appeared to have nothing to offer it. The truth was folded in the leather folder he carried, and he had no intention of opening it. His father, Harold Sterling, had built this company over 40 years from a single rented floor to a name that appeared in financial pages every week. When Harold passed that spring, he left behind one heir, and it wasn't the polished successor the board expected. It was a 36-year-old man raising his family alone, who had spent the last decade away from the corporate world his father ruled, and who wanted to know one thing before he took the seat. He wanted to know what his father's company had become. So he had walked in the front door as a stranger carrying a proposal that meant nothing, to be judged by people who didn't know his name. If they treated him well, he would learn something. If they treated him badly, he would learn more. He rode the elevator to the 31st floor with two men in tailored suits who talked over his head about a golf weekend, neither of them glancing at him once. The woman running Sterling in his father's absence was Victoria Delgado. By the time Mateo reached the executive floor, her reputation had preceded her. She was 38, sharp and ruthless, the kind of executive who had clawed her way into every room she had ever entered and never forgot the climb. The board had not yet named a new president, and everyone on that floor understood that Victoria believed the title belonged to her. She moved through the hallways like a woman measuring the office for new furniture. Mateo was escorted into a boardroom where 9 executives sat along a dark glass table, coffee cooling before them, phones face down but within reach. Victoria was at the head in a charcoal suit cut with surgical precision, and she did not stand when he entered. She looked at his folder, then his shoes, then his face, and something in her expression settled on a verdict before he had said a single word. "You have 20 minutes, she said. "Most people need less." Mateo placed his folder on the table and did not open it. He spoke instead about what actually mattered to him, the people. He described a small company built around giving forgotten workers a way to be heard, a platform that rewarded contribution over title. And he spoke about it plainly, without slides, without the practice music of a man begging for money. He had raised his family on the belief that a person's value had nothing to do with their letterhead, and everything he said came from that. Victoria interrupted him before he reached the middle. "This is philosophy," she said, tapping a manicured finger against the glass. "We invest in returns, not sentiment." Some of the executives smiled at that, the small, automatic smiles of people who had learned that agreeing with Victoria was a form of career insurance. Mateo watched the smiles travel around the table and understood exactly what kind of room he had walked into. A man to Victoria's right, a broad-shouldered executive named Philip Mendez, leaned back in his chair and studied Mateo's suit with open amusement. "That jacket," he said. "Is it the proposal or the collateral?" The laughter this time was louder, shameless, and Mateo let it pass without flinching. He had learned long ago that a man's dignity is not something a room can vote on. "I've heard enough," Victoria said. She hadn't heard half of it. She slid the untouched folder back across the glass with 2 fingers, like returning something that had been left on her desk by mistake. "Sterling built its name with winners. I'm sure there's some program somewhere better suited for whatever this is." Her tone made the word program sound like an insult, and the executives around her arranged their faces to match. Mateo picked up his folder without arguing. He had come to learn, and he was learning. But before he had learned it, he had harbored a small, unreasonable hope, the kind a man doesn't admit to, that his father's company might have kept some of the decency his father had put into it. That hope was thinner now. He rose from his chair, buttoned his old jacket, and did the one thing that had carried him through every difficult room in his life. He offered his hand, reaching across the corner of the table toward Victoria. An ordinary gesture. A thank you for the time, though the time had been cruel. It was the reflex of a man who believed that courtesy cost nothing and revealed everything. For a moment, the room went still, every executive at that table turning to see what their leader would do with a stranger's open hand. Victoria looked at his hand the way one looks at something spilled. She did not take it. Instead, she withdrew her own hand and placed it in her lap. And when she spoke, she made sure the whole table could hear. "You don't deserve my handshake," she said, and let the phrase hang in the air where everyone could admire it. The words landed cleanly, without heat, which made them worse. Matteo lowered his arm, didn't flinch, didn't stammer, didn't search for a comeback. Something in him simply went very still. The way a room goes still when a decision has already been made and only the paperwork remains. He looked at Victoria one moment longer than comfortable, and in that look there was nothing she could use, no anger she could dismiss, no hurt she could enjoy. "Thank you for your time," Matteo said. His voice was even. He meant it, in a way none of them could have guessed, because they had just given him the answer he had come for. Victoria had already turned to the executive beside her, finished with him. But the calm on his face seemed to get under her skin, and she reached for her phone with an irritated flick. "Have security escort him down," she said to the room. "To no one in particular, to everyone. I don't want him wandering the executive floor. It's not the image we project." Philip Mendez smiled and murmured something to the man beside him, and the laughter traveled around the table once more. 2 security officers appeared in the doorway in less than a minute. Polite and uncertain, clearly instructed to remove a man who had done nothing but stand up and say thank you. Matteo slid his folder under his arm and walked toward them without needing to be asked twice. At the threshold he looked back once, not at Victoria, but at the room, at the smiling faces of people who had learned to confuse cruelty with standards. Then he walked into the hallway and let the door close behind them. The officers escorted him toward the elevator bank with the uncomfortable courtesy of men who couldn't tell whether they were escorting a nuisance or a stranger who didn't deserve to be kept waiting. Matteo made it easy for them. He asked one how long he'd been working in the building, and the younger officer, surprised to be spoken to like a person, admitted he'd been there 3 years. Matteo nodded and said it seemed like a good building. He meant the building itself. He was less sure about the people at the top. In the elevator, Matteo told them he'd wait a few minutes before going down, that he was expecting a call, and asked if he could stand by the window at the end of the floor. There was no rule against a departing visitor waiting for their ride, and the officers, relieved to be released from a task that embarrassed them, drifted back toward the executive suite. So Matteo stood by the video wall overlooking the city, a dismissed guest with a leather folder now invisible, and began to watch. From that corner he could see a long stretch of the working floor below the executive level, an open expanse of desks where the real company lived. He watched a young analyst carry a printout toward a glass office, stop at the door, and be waved away without a glance. He watched a group of managers laugh at something on a phone while a junior colleague stood at the edge of their circle, unrecognized, waiting for a moment in the conversation that never came. The building had a rhythm, and the rhythm was this: attention flowed upward, and contempt flowed downward. He noticed one woman in particular, a designer or analyst, he couldn't tell from a distance, who approached a senior manager with a tablet extended and something anxious in her posture. She was pointing at the screen, explaining, and Matteo could read the shape of her hope even from across the floor. The manager barely looked, shook his head, tapped his watch, and walked away mid-sentence, leaving her with the tablet still raised toward the space where he had been. She lowered it slowly and returned to her desk, and Matteo felt something tighten in his chest that had nothing to do with his own grief. This was the culture Victoria Delgado had built, and she had built it well. Wherever Matteo looked, he saw the same rule applied without a rulebook. Ideas were worth hearing only when they came from people who had already arrived. Those who didn't matter learned to stay quiet. The company had become a machine for making people feel small, and it carried his father's name at the top of the lobby in brushed steel. He thought about the company he had described upstairs, the platform for rewarding contribution over title, and understood now why the room had laughed. To them it had sounded like sentimentality, because they lived in a place where the opposite was law. Victoria had called it charity, but Matteo had watched his father run this company on a different principle for most of his life, and he knew the difference between charity and respect. Charity looks down, respect looks forward. At some point during the last year, Sterling had forgotten how to look forward. The younger security officer passed by again and asked, not unkindly, if his call had come through. Matteo said it had and thanked him and said he'd go down now, but he didn't go down. He waited until the officer turned the corner. Then he stood by the window a while longer, watching the woman with the tablet as she sat at her desk trying to compose herself. He would remember her. He didn't know her name yet, but he would remember the exact set of her shoulders when the manager walked away, because it was the truest thing he had seen in that building all morning. For a moment, Matteo considered ending it there. He could pull out his phone, make one call, and by afternoon Victoria Delgado would understand precisely whom she had refused to touch. It would be satisfying. And it would also be petty, and it would teach her nothing except that she had guessed wrong about a man's bank account. That wasn't the lesson. The problem in this building had never been that Victoria didn't recognize an heir. The problem was how she treated a man she believed was nobody. So Matteo made a different decision, standing by that glass wall with the city spread beneath him. He would keep his name to himself a little longer. He would let Victoria and her executives keep walking the path they were already walking, because he wanted to see how far they would go while they believed no one important was watching. A person's character, his father used to say, is what they do when they think it doesn't matter. Matteo intended to give this company every opportunity to show him its character. He pocketed his badge instead of returning it, tucked the folder under his arm, and finally stepped into the elevator. As the doors closed on the 31st floor, he caught one last glimpse of the executive hallway where Victoria had reappeared, already laughing with Philip Mendez about something, the visitor in the grey suit forgotten so completely as if he had never existed. She had no idea that the morning she had just wasted was the most expensive meeting of her career. Downstairs, Matteo walked out through the same 40 feet of marble he had entered, past reception, past the steel letters of his family's name. A valet asked if he needed his car brought around, and Matteo said no, he would walk for a while. Outside, the air was fresh and the street was ordinary, filled with people going about their day with no idea what had happened on the 31st floor and no reason to care. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment and looked up at the tower. He wasn't angry. Anger would have been easy and burned fast. What he felt instead was firmer and colder, a kind of clarity that settled into the bones and didn't leave. He had come to Sterling to find out if his father's company deserved him, and he had gotten his answer in less than 20 minutes, delivered by a woman who thought a handshake was something a person had to earn from her. Now he had a different question, and it would take longer to answer. Not whether the company deserved him, but whether he could give it back what it had lost. Matteo turned and walked into the crowd, an ordinary man in an old grey suit, carrying a leather folder full of things no one upstairs had bothered to read. Behind him, the tower rose into the morning, indifferent, self-assured, run by people who slept well because they had never imagined that the man they humiliated might be the man who signed their names. He let the building shrink behind him and made a silent promise as he walked. The next time he was in that boardroom, he would offer his hand again, and this time everyone in the room would understand exactly what it meant to refuse it. Matteo didn't go far. He walked 2 blocks, bought a coffee he didn't drink, and made a single phone call from a quiet corner near the park. The man he called was Robert Hayes, the chairman of Sterling's board, one of the few living people who knew who Matteo was and why he had walked into that building that morning without a name. Matteo told him plainly what he had seen and what he had heard, and asked for just one thing. He asked if the board could meet that afternoon, earlier than planned, in the building itself. Robert had been prepared to move slowly, to give the transition the appearance of ceremony. But he had known Harold Sterling for 30 years, and he heard in Matteo's voice the same flat certainty the old man used to have just before a decision that couldn't be undone. He told Matteo that the board members were already in town for the sessions vote, that gathering them late in the afternoon was possible, and that he would handle it quietly. No one on the executive floor would know until the moment Matteo chose. That was all Matteo wanted. He hung up and turned back toward the tower. He had a few hours to fill, and he didn't want to spend them far from what he had come to understand. So Matteo returned to Sterling. Not to the executive floor this time, but to the wide public atrium 2 levels up, where a cafe and a row of seats allowed visitors and staff to mingle unnoticed. He still wore the grey suit, still carried the folder. To anyone passing, he was a contractor waiting for a meeting, a salesperson killing time, no one with a coffee. It was the perfect place to watch a company be itself. For nearly an hour, he simply listened. The tables around him filled and emptied with employees on break, and their chatter told him more than any report his father's accountants could have prepared. He heard a young man describe a project he had poured 3 months into, only to see a director present it upstairs as his own. He heard 2 women exchange the careful, coded language of people who had learned that honesty in this building was a liability. He heard the name Victoria spoken the way people speak the name of whether they can't control. What struck Matteo wasn't that the company was cruel. Cruelty could have been fixed with a memo. What struck him was how completely the cruelty had been disguised as excellence. Everyone repeating Victoria's favorite word, winners, seemed to believe they were describing a standard rather than a wall. They had been taught that dignity was something distributed by rank, that a person without status hadn't yet earned the right to be heard, and they had accepted it so fully that they applied it to each other without being told. He recognized her before he remembered from where. The woman with the tablet, the one he had seen from the window that morning, was at the cafe counter waiting for coffee, and she moved now the way she had after the manager walked away. Shoulders hunched, occupying as little space as the world would allow. Matteo watched her pay, watched her hesitate between sitting and fleeing back to her desk. And when the seat beside him came free, he did the simplest thing. He asked if the seat was taken. Her name was Grace Wetman, and she told him with the surprise of someone not used to being asked anything at all. She had been at Sterling for 4 years, in the product design group. And when Matteo said he was a salesman waiting for a meeting and asked what she worked on, something in her loosened. She spoke about an idea she had built on her own time, a way to route suggestions from the floor staff directly to leadership, to catch the good ones before they died in someone's inbox. She spoke quickly, the way people speak about what they love when they've stopped expecting anyone to listen. Matteo listened to all of it. He asked real questions, the kind that showed he'd heard the last answer, and watched her straighten by degrees as the conversation went on, as if being taken seriously was a posture the body remembered even after years without practice. When he asked what leadership had said about her idea, the light went out of her again. She told him she'd presented it to a director twice. The first time he didn't have time. The second time he told her Sterling didn't need ideas from people who hadn't earned a seat at the table. He said the table only had room for so many people. She wasn't one of them, Grace said, turning her cup between her hands. She said it without bitterness, which was somehow worse than bitterness, because it meant she had come to believe it. Matteo looked at this woman who had built something useful on her own time and been told her contribution didn't count because of where she sat today. And he thought about his father and the platform he himself had described upstairs that morning, the one Victoria had called charity. He didn't tell Grace who he was. It would have changed everything about the conversation, and he wanted the true version, the one people only give. Matteo sat alone with his cold coffee after she left, and the last of his uncertainty burned away. He had come to Sterling wondering if the company deserved him. He understood now that the question had been wrong from the start. His father hadn't built this place for the people at the top. He had built it for the Graces, the ones on the floor with ideas and no status. And somewhere in Victoria's years of rising, everything had been turned upside down, until it served the few and crushed the many. Matteo wasn't going to walk in and fire the front row. He was going to turn the company right side up again. That decision settled into him like ballast, and with it came a strange calm. He no longer needed to prove anything to Victoria Delgado. She had already shown him everything he needed to know, and she would keep showing it, because people who assume they aren't being watched never think to stop. He pulled out his phone and confirmed with Robert Hayes that the board would be in the building by 5. Then he did the last thing his plan required. He called in a favor from an old friend of his father's and quietly arranged to change his suit. 2 floors up, Victoria Delgado was preparing for what she believed would be the best afternoon of her career. The news had reached her that the board was meeting early, and she read it the way any ambitious person reads any acceleration, as confirmation that what she wanted was running toward her. She was certain the session's vote was about to make her president, and she intended to walk into it having already gathered her executives, so the board could see a leader who commanded her floor. She called them to the same glass boardroom where Matteo had been humiliated that morning, all 9 of them arranged along the dark table, and she stood at the head with the ease of a woman about to be crowned. Philip Mendez was at her right hand, and the others wore the anxious, elevated expressions of people who had bet their careers on a rise and were about to collect. Victoria watched them and felt the pleasant weight of everything going according to plan. She used the meeting to teach. That was how she thought of it, teaching, though what she did was closer to grinding a lesson into people until they mistook the lesson for wisdom. She reminded them what Sterling stood for. She told them the company had no room for sentimentality and no patience for people who confused effort with value. And to make the point clear, she returned to the morning's example, the man in the old grey suit who had stood at this same table and asked her to shake his hand. "You all saw it," Victoria said, and some of the executives smiled before she finished. "A man walks in here with a worn jacket and a folder full of feelings, and he expects us to fund his charity. Then he has the nerve to offer me his hand as if we were equals." She let the contempt curl in her voice and saw it reflected in the faces around the table. That is exactly the kind of thinking that kills a company. Winners don't apologize for standards. They don't shake every hand offered to them. Philip Mendez laughed and added that they should frame the jacket as a warning for visitors, and the room rewarded him. The lesson had become a performance, and Victoria directed it, feeding on the agreement, certain that every nodding head confirmed she deserved the title the board was about to give her. She didn't notice the meeting had run long. She didn't know the board had already arrived on the floor, gathered in the larger room across the hall, and that the doors between them and her triumph were about to open. She was still speaking when the boardroom door opened without a knock. Robert Hayes walked in, grey-haired, unhurried, and the temperature of the room changed the instant the executives recognized who he was. Victoria stopped mid-sentence, and her face rearranged itself into the bright, capable expression she wore for the board, the one that said she was ready, that she had always been ready. She smoothed her jacket and prepared to be named. "Please," Robert said, and his voice carried the flat authority of a man who didn't need to raise it. "Everyone stand. The board wishes to present the person who will assume the presidency of Sterling Group." The executives rose in a whisper of expensive fabric, and Victoria stood taller than all of them, already half-turned toward Robert, already composing the polite surprise she would show when he said her name. He didn't say her name. He turned toward the open doorway, and every head in the room followed his gaze. And in the threshold stood a man in a suit that fit him like the truth. It took the room a moment. The suit was dark and exact. The posture was easy, the face was calm. And it was only when the calm registered that the recognition came, because the calm was the same. It was the same stillness that had stood at this table that morning and thanked them all for their time before security walked him to the door. Matea Vega stepped into the boardroom, and Victoria Delgado felt the floor tilt beneath everything she thought she had built. The man in the grey suit. The charity case, the hand she had refused in front of her entire floor so everyone could admire her standards. He wasn't a salesman. He wasn't a founder begging for money. He was the person Robert Hayes had just called the president of the entire company, which meant he was the person who now held every career in that room in the palm of the hand she had said, in front of witnesses, didn't deserve it. Colour drained from Victoria's face in stages. She looked at Mateo, then at Robert, then at Mateo again, searching for the version of this moment where she hadn't spent the morning humiliating the man who owned the building. No such version existed. Around the table, the executives who had laughed at his jacket were frozen in attention, and understanding moved through them one by one like a current, the slow horror of people realizing they had performed their worst selves for an audience they would have died to impress. Philip Mendez, who had asked if the jacket was the collateral, had gone the color of the grey suit he had mocked. The others found sudden reasons to study the table, the window, their own hands, anything but the threshold where Mateo stood watching them with an expression that contained no triumph, which was the most frightening thing of all. He wasn't gloating. He was simply looking at them the way a man looks at a room he already fully understands, and letting them feel the full weight of having been seen. Victoria's mind raced through the morning at a speed that offered no mercy. Every word she had chosen for its cruelty came back sharp. "You don't deserve my handshake. Our company doesn't do charity. Have security escort him down." She had said them aloud on purpose, so no one could miss where she drew the line. And every executive in this room had watched her draw it. There would be no quiet way to retract. The insult had been public, and its cost was about to be public too. Mateo let the silence do the work her words had once done. He didn't move to the head of the table. He didn't ask for a chair. He stood in the threshold a moment longer, unhurried, and looked from face to face along the row of executives who had built their careers by agreeing with the woman at the head of the table. Then his eyes settled on Victoria and stayed there, and the whole room understood that whatever happened next belonged entirely to him. Robert Hayes stepped aside to make space, and the gesture was its own announcement. Authority in that building had changed hands, and everyone in the glass boardroom now understood that they had spent the morning auditioning for the only man they should have treated like the future, and that they had, each in their own way, failed. The executives who had laughed loudest were now the stillest. Philip Mendez looked as though he wanted to sink through the floor and disappear beneath the tower with his family's name. Victoria opened her mouth. Whatever she had planned to say, an apology, an explanation, a quick bridge back to the woman she had been 30 seconds ago, none of it came out, because there was nothing to build it from. She had spent her entire career believing that a person's value could be read in their suit and their title, and she had just bet everything on that belief in front of the man who was about to disprove it with his life. The lesson she had been teaching all afternoon was about to be taught back to her in the same room, in front of the same audience, by the only student she had thrown out the door. Mateo finally walked fully into the room, unbuttoned his jacket with one calm hand, walked to the long table, and placed on it the same leather folder no one had bothered to open that morning. He looked at the 9 executives standing at attention and the woman who had refused his hand. And when he spoke, his voice was as even and quiet as it had been when he thanked them on his way out the door. "Please," he said, "sit down. I think we have a lot to discuss." The executives Saturday. They dropped into their chairs with the careful movements of people who no longer trusted the floor, and the glass table that had felt like a throne to them an hour ago now felt like a witness stand. Mateo took the seat at the head, the one Victoria had occupied all afternoon, and Robert Hayes settled silently against the back wall, present but quiet, letting the room belong to the man who had earned it the hard way. Victoria couldn't stay seated. She rose before Mateo said a second word, and the composure she had worn as armor all day cracked into something raw and fast. "Mr. Vega," she said, and the name came out trembling. "I owe you an apology. This morning was a terrible misunderstanding. If I had known who you were, if anyone had told me your position, I would never have spoken to you that way. Please understand. I was protecting the company standards. I didn't know." It was the wrong thing to say. And the moment it left her mouth, she seemed to realize it. But the words were already in the room. Mateo looked at her a long moment, and when he responded, his voice contained no cruelty. "What was it," he asked quietly, "that made it hurt so much?" He wasn't interested in punishing her. He was interested in showing her the exact shape of what she had done, and he did it with one calm question. "If I told you," Mateo said, "that everything you assumed this morning was true. That I really was just a single father with an old suit and a small idea, trying to get someone in this building to listen, with no board and no title and no name waiting at the end of the day. He let the picture form. Would the way you treated me have been right?" The room went completely still. Victoria opened her mouth and found nothing in it. She had built her apology on the premise that her mistake was misreading his status. That if she had known he was powerful, she would have behaved differently. But the question stripped that away and left the real truth underneath exposed. Her fault had never been failing to recognize an heir. Her fault was that she had a rule, and the rule was that people without status didn't deserve courtesy, and she had applied it exactly as designed. "You're not answering," Mateo said softly, "because you already know. The problem was never that you didn't know who I was. The problem is that it wouldn't have mattered. If I had been the man you thought I was, you would have done everything the same, and you would have slept well tonight." He looked along the table at the 9 of them. "And most of you would have too." No one argued. Philip Mendez studied the grain of the glass as if it might open and swallow him. The others stayed very still, because there was nothing to say that wouldn't make things worse. And because some of them, for the first time in years, were beginning to see the world through eyes that weren't their own. Victoria dropped back into her chair, and the fight went out of her posture, replaced by the hollow stillness of a person watching the story she had told herself crumble in real time. Mateo didn't press. He had made the point, and revisiting it would only have turned him into a smaller version of what he was correcting. Instead, he opened the leather folder. Finally, the one that had sat unread on this table that morning, and spread it so everyone could see that it was never a charity proposal at all. It was an assessment. It was his father's original founding letter, the foundational principles Harold Sterling had written when the whole company fit in a single rented floor and fit in a plan. My father built this company on one idea, Martea said, that the person with the answer isn't always the person with the title. That if you want the best from people, you have to be willing to hear it from anyone. At some point, this company decided otherwise. It decided that value is something you inherit with a corner office, and that everyone below a certain line is furniture. He closed the folder. I came here to find out how far that had gone. Now I know. He told them what would happen, and he said it plainly, without theatre. There would be no mass firings that afternoon. No satisfying purge that matched the morning's humiliation. That wasn't how you fixed a culture. You didn't correct contempt with more contempt. Instead, there would be a full review of how Sterling treated people who had no power to defend themselves, top to bottom, and everyone at that table would be measured by it, including him. Then he turned to Victoria, and the room braced itself. You're talented, Martea said. It wasn't a kindness. It was an accounting. No one doubts it. You climbed further than most people in this building, and you did it in rooms that weren't built to let you through. I understand why you thought the wall you built was strength. He held her eyes. But you took what was done to you along the way and turned around and did it to everyone who came after you. That's the one thing this company can't keep. For the first time all day, Victoria's expression wasn't calculation. Something moved behind it, and Martea saw it because he had been waiting. She had clawed her way through rooms exactly like the one she now sat in, rooms full of people ready to decide she didn't deserve their handshake, and she had survived them by becoming the hardest thing in every room she entered. The wall had kept her alive. She had simply never noticed the moment it stopped protecting her and started defining her. I'm removing you as CEO.